The Federal Reserve Chair just made an unprecedented statement. According to the speech, the Department of Justice served grand jury subpoenas that he interprets as threats of criminal charges. The announcement states these subpoenas were delivered on Friday. In the Fed Chair's words, this goes far beyond building renovations or congressional testimony. Most headlines focus on the political drama, the apparent conflict between Powell and the Trump administration, the constitutional questions about Federal Reserve independence. The traditional narrative suggests this represents partisan politics or routine accountability measures. But this superficial analysis misses the fundamental economic mechanisms at play. What we are observing opens the possibility of something beyond a legal dispute or administrative oversight. This puts at stake a stress test of the institutional architecture that has governed global finance for decades. The outcome creates the risk of determining not just who sets interest rates, but how capital flows across borders, how currencies maintain value, and how entire economies respond to crises. The ramifications extend far beyond any single administration's preferences to the basic structure of how economic decisions are made. The Federal Reserve has operated with independence from direct political control since 1913. That independence was never absolute. It was always conditional. Based on an implicit understanding between elected and monetary authorities, politicians provide legitimacy through appointment and confirmation processes. The statement suggests this understanding is breaking down. According to the report, the Department of Justice delivered subpoenas related to his June testimony about the $2.5 billion renovation of Federal Reserve headquarters. The declaration describes these as pretexts. As outlined in the speech, the real issue would be interest rate policy. The Fed Chair describes a situation where the administration seeks faster and deeper rate cuts. The Federal Reserve has maintained rates based on economic data rather than political preferences. If this is interpreted by markets as escalation beyond normal institutional friction, this creates the risk of altering the fundamental dynamics of monetary policy formation. Global financial institutions are observing these developments with growing concern. Currency markets have begun pricing in American political risks that did not exist decades ago. This is where the system reveals itself. Central bank independence is not a legal guarantee. It exists through institutional norms and political restraint. When these norms disintegrate, this opens the possibility of rapid dissolution of independence. If this is interpreted by markets as crossing institutional boundaries, the consequences could be significant. The renovation project became a symbol of broader tensions. Trump visited the construction site in July. As reported, the president publicly disagreed about costs. According to multiple reports, the president alleged gross incompetence in project management. Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vought described the renovation as ostentatious and potentially illegal. These developments created a narrative framework for more serious intervention. The construction project provided cover for questioning Fed independence. The tensions were broadcast live during the presidential visit, creating images that now underpin the reported investigation. The timing is significant. The term as Fed chair expires in May. Trump must nominate a replacement. If this is interpreted by markets as leverage in that selection process, this puts at stake signals to potential nominees that cooperation with administration preferences is expected. This demonstrates the consequences of institutional resistance. Republican Senator Thom Tillis has already announced opposition to any Fed nominees until the investigation resolves. This opposition creates the risk of complicating the confirmation process and extending uncertainty. Other Republican senators are watching carefully before taking public positions. The political dynamics within the Republican Party may determine whether there is sufficient support to complete the current term. The immediate market response was muted. Bond yields remained stable. Stock futures showed minimal movement. Currency markets absorbed the news without significant disruption. This calm reaction masks deeper structural implications. Financial markets are processing this through established frameworks of central bank independence. Market participants assume institutional safeguards will hold. They expect Congress or courts to intervene if necessary. They believe the Federal Reserve's credibility with international investors and central banks will limit political interference. But these assumptions may prove incorrect. The absence of immediate market panic does not indicate the absence of systemic risk. Market complacency frequently persists until the moment institutions actually fail. Institutional investors have begun private discussions about contingency scenarios. Sovereign wealth funds are reassessing dollar exposures. Foreign central banks are reconsidering reserve compositions. These changes happen gradually, away from public view, until they become irreversible. That's where the incentives shift. The Federal Reserve's power comes from market confidence in its decisions. If that confidence erodes, the central bank's ability to influence economic outcomes diminishes rapidly. Political control over monetary policy creates different incentive structures than technocratic independence. Political monetary policy prioritizes short-term growth and employment over long-term price stability. It responds to electoral cycles rather than economic cycles. It accommodates fiscal spending without considering inflationary consequences. These changes do not appear overnight. They develop gradually as market participants adjust expectations. Interest rates fall initially if political pressure forces easier monetary policy, but inflation expectations begin rising if credibility weakens. Long-term borrowing costs may increase even while short-term rates decline. The track record of countries that politicize their central banks shows consistent patterns of credibility deterioration. Argentina, Turkey, and Venezuela provide examples of how political interference destroys monetary policy effectiveness. The international dimensions are equally significant. Federal Reserve independence underpins the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Foreign central banks and governments hold dollars because they trust Fed monetary policy. They assume decisions are based on economic rather than political considerations. A politicized Federal Reserve threatens this confidence. Alternative reserve currencies become more attractive. China's yuan, the European Union's euro, even cryptocurrency networks benefit from reduced dollar credibility. This shift would not happen immediately, but the process, once initiated, becomes difficult to reverse. If this is interpreted by markets as precedent for future administrations, this puts at stake lasting consequences. If criminal investigations can be used to pressure Federal Reserve chairs, every future monetary policy disagreement becomes a potential legal matter. Democratic and Republican administrations would have access to this tool. The independence that insulated monetary policy from partisan cycles would disappear permanently. Central banks would become another arena for political competition. The economic consequences would extend far beyond any single administration's preferences. Economists across different political spectrums suggest that central bank independence is essential for macroeconomic stability. This academic consensus is being tested for the first time in decades through direct political pressure. The outcome will influence how other democracies structure their own monetary institutions. As framed in the speech, this represents a choice between evidence-based policy and political pressure. In the statement's words, the real choice would be between institutional stability and political control. According to the declaration, the outcome affects not just interest rates, but the entire structure of economic governance. The Federal Reserve was created after the 1907 financial panic. The design deliberately separated monetary policy from political cycles. This separation was intended to prevent the boom and bust cycles that characterized 19th century American banking. The current crisis tests whether this institutional design can survive intense political pressure. Historical precedents suggest that once central bank independence is compromised, it becomes difficult to restore. Countries that politicize their monetary policy struggle to regain credibility. Brazil, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand provide examples of how restoring central bank independence requires decades of institutional discipline. The cost of rebuilding credibility always exceeds the cost of maintaining it. This is the part most discussions skip. Monetary policy credibility is a network effect. It requires global acceptance. Once that acceptance begins eroding, the process accelerates through feedback loops. According to the report, the criminal investigation targets testimony about building renovations. But as described in the statement, the underlying issue would be interest rate policy. Trump has consistently expressed preference for lower rates to stimulate economic growth. The Federal Reserve has maintained higher rates to control inflation. This disagreement reflects different priorities and time horizons. Political leaders focus on immediate growth and employment. Central bankers worry about long-term price stability and financial system integrity. This fundamental tension between short and long-term objectives lies at the heart of why central bank independence was originally established. Politicians face electoral pressures that favor immediate economic stimulation. Central bankers make unpopular decisions necessary for long-term stability. If this is interpreted by markets as removing this institutional separation, this places monetary policy decisions directly under political control, and that changes the balance. When political pressure can force monetary policy changes, the balance between growth and stability shifts permanently toward short-term stimulation. The implications for price formation are profound. Companies adjust pricing strategies based on expectations about future monetary policy. If that policy becomes politicized, this creates the risk of companies needing to consider electoral cycles in investment and employment decisions. Workers negotiate wages based on inflation expectations. If these expectations become linked to political outcomes rather than economic fundamentals, wage formation becomes more volatile. Investors allocate capital based on long-term risk assessments. Politicized monetary policy increases these risks and elevates capital costs. The broader economic implications depend on how this conflict resolves. If independence is maintained and the term is completed without criminal charges, institutional norms may survive. If the investigation forces resignation or conviction, this opens the possibility of precedent for future political interference. If Trump successfully nominates a more compliant successor, market confidence in Fed independence may erode gradually. The speed and extent of this erosion will determine the economic consequences. Intermediate scenarios are also possible. The position may be maintained, but policies modified to accommodate political pressures. This partial capitulation would still harm institutional credibility while avoiding direct confrontation. The precedent of yielding under pressure would encourage future political interference. Two scenarios emerge from this institutional breakdown. The first involves gradual erosion of Federal Reserve credibility. Interest rates fall initially if political pressure forces easier monetary policy. But inflation expectations rise if market participants lose confidence in the Fed's commitment to price stability. In this scenario, short-term economic growth accelerates. Unemployment falls below natural rates. Asset prices inflate as easy money flows into markets. But these benefits prove temporary. Rising inflation expectations push long-term interest rates higher. The dollar weakens against other currencies as foreign investors question American monetary policy. International trade becomes more expensive. Import costs rise. The initial growth boost reverses as inflation erodes purchasing power and higher long-term rates constrain investment. This pattern historically takes between 2 and 5 years to manifest completely. The initial benefits of easier monetary policy mask the long-term costs until it is too late to reverse the damage. The second scenario involves immediate loss of monetary policy credibility. Financial markets react sharply to the breakdown of institutional norms. Bond yields spike as investors demand higher compensation for inflation risk. The dollar falls rapidly against major currencies. International capital flows reverse as foreign investors seek more stable monetary environments. The Federal Reserve loses the ability to provide economic stimulus during future recessions because market participants no longer trust its inflation commitments. This scenario develops within weeks or months if market confidence collapses rapidly. Neither scenario preserves the economic stability that Federal Reserve independence was designed to protect. The differences are in timing and severity rather than ultimate outcomes. What is at stake is the fundamental structure of how the American economy functions. As described in the statement, the criminal investigation represents a fundamental challenge to the institutional architecture of American economic governance. According to the report, the immediate focus is on building renovations. The declaration states the deeper question would be whether independent monetary policy can survive intense political pressure. In the speech's words, the answer will determine not just interest rate policy, but the credibility of American economic institutions in global markets. The consequences extend beyond any single administration's preferences to the basic structure of how economic decisions are made. Other countries are observing these developments as a test of whether democracies can maintain institutional independence under populist pressure. The outcome will influence how future administrations in other democracies approach their own central banks. The geopolitical ramifications are equally significant. American allies depend on dollar stability for international trade. American adversaries benefit from any erosion in confidence in American institutions. China and Russia have actively promoted alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar. Politicized monetary policy in the United States would accelerate adoption of these alternatives. Countries that traditionally maintain reserves in dollars would begin diversifying to other currencies. Central banks that coordinate policy with the Federal Reserve would reconsider these relationships. Trade agreements denominated in dollars would become less attractive. These changes happen gradually, but are difficult to reverse once alternative patterns are established. The dollar's privileged position in the international financial system is not guaranteed. It requires continued confidence in American institutions. This confidence took decades to build, but erodes rapidly if monetary policy becomes unpredictable. Countries that have lost reserve currency status historically face substantial economic costs as they lose the benefits of privileged international financing. The legal precedent also matters. If a Federal Reserve chair faces criminal charges for resisting political pressure, this puts at stake the selection of future candidates by compliance rather than expertise. This would fundamentally change the type of person willing to serve in central bank leadership positions. Qualified economists would avoid positions that carry personal legal risk. Political candidates without technical credibility would become more attractive to administrations seeking control. This shift would degrade monetary policy quality regardless of independence considerations. Technical expertise in monetary economics requires years of training and experience that cannot be easily replaced by political loyalty. The current crisis also reveals deeper tensions about democracy and technical expertise. Elected politicians argue they have popular mandate to influence all government policies, including monetary policy. Technocrats argue that some decisions require specialized expertise isolated from political pressures. This debate extends beyond monetary policy to areas like public health, climate change, and financial regulation. The outcome of the current confrontation will establish precedents about where lines are drawn between democratic authority and technical expertise. These issues have become more salient as political polarization has increased and confidence in institutions has declined. The challenge is maintaining technical expertise while preserving democratic accountability. What to observe ahead is not just the legal proceedings described in the statement. Watch for changes in long-term interest rates. Monitor currency markets for dollar weakness. Track international commentary from other central banks. These indicators will reveal whether market confidence in Federal Reserve independence is eroding. Warning signs include growing spreads between American and foreign bonds, increased volatility in currency markets, statements from foreign central banks about policy cooperation, changes in international reserve compositions, comments from rating agencies about American institutional credibility. These developments may precede formal policy changes by months or years. Markets frequently anticipate institutional changes before they become official. The institutional stability that has underpinned decades of economic growth is being tested in real time. The outcome will determine not just how monetary policy is made, but whether the United States can maintain its central position in the global financial system. The central bank independence system is facing its greatest test since its creation. The consequences are too profound to reverse easily once institutional damage is done.